8 Navy SEALs, 90 enemy fighters, a valley designed to be their grave. The radios were jammed, ammunition was running out, and air support was 18 minutes too far. They had 5 minutes left to live. Then something impossible happened. A single shot rang out from a mountain ridge nearly 2,000 meters away, and an enemy commander dropped instantly. Then another shot, and another. Someone was out there, fighting for them from the shadows. But here's what made their blood run cold. The operator covering them had been declared dead 3 years ago. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If stories like this matter to you, please consider subscribing. What happened next would reveal a truth the military tried to bury. The extraction was supposed to be simple. Lieutenant Bridger Calloway had run operations like this dozens of times before. Move in under darkness, secure the asset, slip out before anyone knew they were there. Clean, efficient, textbook. His team had rehearsed the route through the valley so many times they could navigate it blind. Every boulder, every choke point, every turn had been mapped and memorized. By the time they reached the compound at U-215 hours, the mission was already ahead of schedule. The target was a translator named Idris, a thin man in his 40s who had been feeding intelligence on Taliban leadership networks to coalition forces for 18 months. He had called in the emergency extraction code 3 days earlier. His cover was blown. He had maybe 72 hours before they found him. The SEALs moved through the compound like shadows, clearing rooms with practiced silence. Idris was waiting in the basement, a single bag clutched to his chest, eyes wide with fear and relief. Chief Petty Officer Rylan Moss pulled him to his feet and gave him a quick once-over. No injuries? Good to move. They were out of the building in under 4 minutes. The 8-man SEAL team moved in a tactical column through the rocky terrain, night vision turning the world into shades of green and gray. Petty Officer Anson Riggs led as point man, his eyes scanning every shadow, every ridge, every potential threat. Behind him came Calloway, then Idris sandwiched between operators for protection. Moss brought up the rear, his weapons sweeping their six constantly. The rest of the team maintained spacing in sectors, a well-oiled machine honed by years of training and combat deployments together. At RO-2-4A7 hours, they entered the valley. The exfil route had been chosen specifically because it offered the fastest path to the landing zone while avoiding known enemy patrol routes. The valley was narrow, flanked by steep ridges on both sides, with scattered boulders providing minimal cover. Intel had shown it clear. Satellite imagery confirmed no recent activity. It should have been safe. Riggs stopped so suddenly that Calloway nearly walked into him. The point man's fist shot up, closed tight. Freeze. Everyone went still, weapons coming up instinctively. Riggs tilted his head, listening. For 5 seconds, nothing. Just the sound of wind moving through the rocks and the distant bark of a dog somewhere in the valley below. Then Riggs turned his head slightly, his night vision sweeping left. His hand moved again. Enemy movement. Multiple contacts. Before Calloway could process the signal, the night exploded into daylight. Spotlights erupted from 3 different directions, flooding the valley floor with blinding white light. The SEALs' night vision devices washed out instantly, leaving them blind for critical seconds as they ripped the goggles off. When Calloway's eyes adjusted, his stomach dropped. Fighters were pouring out of concealed positions along both ridges and blocking the path ahead. Not a patrol. Not a random encounter. This was a prepared ambush, and they were standing in the center of it. The first rounds cracked past Calloway's head before he could shout orders. The team reacted on instinct, sprinting for the only cover available, a cluster of large boulders about 40 meters to their right. Petty Officer Dalton Kemper was halfway there when an RPG detonated against a rock face behind them. The blast wave threw him forward, shrapnel tearing through his shoulder. He hit the ground hard but kept moving, crawling the last 10 meters while Petty Officer Everett Kane laid down covering fire with his M249 squad automatic weapon. They made it behind the boulders as rounds chewed into the rock around them, chips of stone spraying like shrapnel. Petty Officer Soren Hallstad, the team's corpsman, immediately went to work on Kemper, cutting away his uniform top to assess the wounds. Blood was spreading across Kemper's shoulder and down his arm, but he was conscious and breathing. Hallstad worked quickly, packing the wounds and wrapping pressure bandages while the sound of gunfire intensified around them. Calloway pressed himself against the boulder and keyed his radio. His voice was steady despite his racing heart. Warhawk 6, this is Phantom 1. We are in contact. Heavy enemy force. Grid November Delta 4729. Request immediate close air support and quick reaction force. He released the key and waited. Static crackled in his earpiece. Then a distorted voice broke through. Phantom 1, heavy jamming in your area. Rotary wing is 18 minutes out. Fixed wing is 25 minutes. Acknowledge, 18 minutes. Calloway looked around at his team. Moss was already doing a tactical assessment, counting muzzle flashes and estimating enemy strength. Petty Officer Jace Tennyson, their communications specialist, was frantically trying different frequencies, searching for a clear channel. Petty Officer Lysander Vogt had his explosive ordnance kit open, inventorying what they had left. Riggs and Kane were returning fire, picking targets carefully. Idris was curled against a rock, hands over his head, whispering prayers in Pashto. Moss crawled over to Calloway, keeping low. His face was grim. LT, we've got 87 fighters that I can count, probably more moving into position. They've got us in a textbook kill box, 3 sides covered, and they're pushing us toward the 4th, which I guarantee is pre-sighted for mortars or heavy weapons. Calloway nodded slowly. He had already come to the same conclusion. This was not a hasty ambush. Someone had known their route. Someone had leaked their operational plan. The enemy had time to prepare, to position forces, to set up a trap designed to kill every last one of them. Tennyson crawled over, his expression dark. Comms are fried, LT. They've got a jammer somewhere close. I can barely get through to base, and it's full of interference. We're effectively cut off. Calloway absorbed this information with a sinking feeling. No clear communications meant no ability to talk the helicopter in safely. It meant no way to coordinate with air support. It meant they were on their own. Kane fired another burst, then ducked back as return fire hammered their position. He looked at Calloway and held up his ammunition pouch. I've got maybe 200 rounds left. After that, I'm down to my rifle. Vought spoke up without looking away from his kit. I've got 4 frags and 2 smokes. That's it. Riggs checked his own magazines. 3 mags left. Same for most of us. Halstad finished bandaging Kemper and moved to Calloway's side. His voice was quiet but steady. Kemper's stable for now, but he's lost blood. He can still fight, but he needs real medical attention within a few hours. Calloway nodded. He looked at his watch. 5 minutes had passed since the ambush began. The enemy fire was intensifying. They were not rushing the position because they did not need to. They were professional, disciplined. They would tighten the noose slowly, methodically, until the Americans ran out of ammunition or made a desperate break for it. Either way, the result would be the same. Moss must have been thinking the same thing. His face was set in hard lines as he checked his rifle. LT, what's the play? It was not really a question. They both knew there were no good options. Calloway scanned the area through his scope, looking for any avenue of escape, any weakness in the enemy formation. There was nothing. The valley walls were too steep to climb quickly. The open ground between their position and any other cover was a death sentence. They were pinned. Calloway made his decision. We make our stand here. We hold as long as we can. We make them pay for every inch. The helicopter gets here, we break for the LZ, and we get on that bird. Until then, we fight smart. Controlled fire, make every round count. We've been in worse. The last part was a lie, but it was the kind of lie leaders told when there was nothing else to say. The team nodded. They were professionals. They knew the score. Vought redistributed the grenades, making sure everyone had at least one. Tennyson kept working on the radio, trying to punch through the jamming. Kane repositioned to get a better angle on an enemy machine gun team that was setting up on the western ridge. Riggs and Moss coordinated their fire sectors. Kemper, despite his wounds, loaded a fresh magazine and took up a position. Even Idris, terrified as he was, accepted a pistol from Halstad and nodded that he understood how to use it. The enemy fire reached a crescendo. Rounds were coming from every direction now, hammering the boulders, kicking up dirt and stone fragments. A rocket-propelled grenade streaked past and detonated 30 meters behind them, the explosion ringing in their ears. Another RPG hit a boulder to their left, showering them with debris. Calloway could see the enemy fighters maneuvering, closing the distance in short rushes, using cover effectively. They were well trained. Probably former Afghan National Army or seasoned Taliban fighters who had been fighting American forces for 2 decades. They knew how to conduct an assault. Calloway thought about his family, his wife and 2 daughters back in Virginia Beach. He thought about the last conversation he had with his oldest daughter before this deployment. She had asked him if he would be home for her birthday in 3 weeks. He had promised her he would. That promise felt very far away now. Vought spoke quietly beside him. "It's been an honor, boys." The words hung in the air. Nobody responded because there was nothing to say. They all felt it. This was how it ended. In a nameless valley in the Hindu Kush, surrounded by an enemy that wanted them dead, cut off from support, running out of ammunition. They would fight to the last round and the last man, but the mathematics were simple and brutal. 8 against 90 was not a fight. It was an execution. Then something happened that made no sense. The sound came first, a sharp crack that cut through the chaos of AK-47 fire and machine gun bursts. It was different, distant. A single rifle shot from a heavy caliber weapon. Calloway barely registered it before an enemy team leader, 400 meters away and shouting orders to his men, dropped like a puppet with cut strings. Just collapsed. One moment he was standing, the next he was on the ground, not moving. The SEALs all noticed it. Moss lowered his rifle slightly, staring at the fallen enemy. That was not one of ours. Wrong direction. Calloway scanned the ridges with his scope, trying to find the source of the shot. The enemy was confused too. Several fighters were looking around, trying to figure out where the shot had come from. Then it happened again. Another crack. Another enemy fighter dropped. This one was a machine gunner on the western ridge, the same one Kane had been tracking. He was in the middle of loading a belt of ammunition when the round hit him. He crumpled over his weapon. The fighters around him scattered, looking for cover, clearly spooked. This was not American close air. Support. This was not a helicopter. This was something else. A third shot. A spotter with binoculars, positioned on a rocky outcrop to observe the battlefield, jerked backward and fell. The shot had come from an impossible distance, from a ridge that Calloway estimated was at least 1,800 meters away, in darkness, with no visible laser designation or infrared marking, just pure marksmanship. Riggs was the first to say it out loud. "Someone's up there." His voice carried a mix of confusion and hope. Moss was already scanning the distant ridge with his scope, trying to spot the shooter. "I don't see anything. No muzzle flash suppressor, no thermal signature, nothing. But someone is definitely shooting." Calloway kept his scope trained on the area where he thought the shots originated. For just a fraction of a second, he saw it. A single muzzle flash, impossibly far away, and then nothing. Darkness. The enemy fighters were starting to panic. They were firing wildly at the mountain ridge, spraying rounds into the darkness with no clear target. Their discipline was breaking down. Whoever was up there had just killed 3 of their leaders in less than a minute, and they had no idea where the shots were coming from or how to stop them. It was like being hunted by a ghost. Halstead was watching the enemy formation with tactical interest. Every shot is a leadership target. Squad leaders, spotters, machine gunners. Whoever that is, they're not shooting randomly. They're dismantling their command structure. Vought shook his head in disbelief. How can they even see them? There's no laser designation, no forward observer, no infrared. It's just raw shooting. Another shot rang out. This time it took down a fighter carrying a PKM machine gun. He was in the process of setting up to suppress the SEAL's position when the round hit him. He dropped the weapon and fell forward. The fighter next to him grabbed the PKM and tried to take over, but another shot dropped him too. 2 shots, maybe 5 seconds apart. Both perfect hits. The remaining enemy fighters around that position abandoned the weapon and ran for better cover. Tennyson looked at Calloway with wide eyes. "LT, they're not just covering us. Look at the pattern. Every shot they take opens up a corridor for us." Calloway realized Tennyson was right. The sniper was not just randomly killing enemy fighters. Each target eliminated created a gap in the enemy's encirclement, and those gaps were always in the direction the SEALs needed to move to reach the landing zone. 3 shots to the northwest, clearing a path through that sector. Then the sniper would shift fire to the east, eliminating flanking elements before they could reposition. It was not covering fire, it was coordination. Moss caught on immediately. They're guiding us. They're creating lanes for us to move through. Calloway felt his tactical mind shift gears. This changed everything. They were not just receiving random help from a friendly unit. Someone up on that mountain knew exactly where they were, knew exactly where they needed to go, and was systematically clearing a path for them. The question was who and how they knew. Calloway made the call. All right, listen up. Someone on that mountain is giving us lanes. We're going to move when they shoot. Standard leapfrog, fire, and movement. Moss, you see the pattern. Moss nodded. Yeah, LT, they're opening corridors for us. Let's use them. Calloway looked at each member of his team. When the next shot comes, we move. Halstad, you're with Kemper. Keep him mobile. Tennyson, grab Idris. Everyone else, watch your sectors and move fast. Questions? There were none. The team prepared to move, checking weapons and redistributing ammunition. Idris looked terrified, but determined. He understood that staying here meant death. Kemper gritted his teeth and nodded that he was ready, even though his face was pale from blood loss. They waited, listening for the next shot. It came 30 seconds later. A crack from the mountain, and an enemy spotter on the northern ridge collapsed. Immediately, Calloway signaled, and the team moved. They broke from cover in pairs, sprinting 50 meters to a new position behind a fallen boulder. Kane and Riggs provided covering fire while the others moved. The enemy tried to react, but another shot from the mountain took out the fighter, who was organizing the response. The SEALs made it to the new position without taking fire. They did it again. The sniper eliminated a radio operator, and the enemy communications collapsed into confusion. Calloway's team advanced another 40 meters, this time to a small depression that offered better protection. Halstad helped Kemper along, the wounded SEAL moving slower but keeping up. Idris stayed close to Tennyson, following his every move. The pattern continued. The sniper would identify a target, eliminate it, and the SEALs would move through the gap created. It was like fighting alongside someone who could read the battlefield 3 moves ahead. Kane paused during one movement to reload and shook his head in amazement. It's like they're inside our heads. How do they know what we're going to do before we do it? Vought had no answer. None of them did. But the results spoke for themselves. They were advancing toward the landing zone. The enemy's encirclement was collapsing. What should have been a massacre was turning into a coordinated fighting withdrawal. But the enemy was not stupid. After losing a dozen fighters to the mysterious sniper, their commander adapted. He started spreading his forces wider, using terrain features that the sniper could not see from the ridge. Dead ground, folds in the earth, reverse slopes. The enemy fighters moved through these areas, trying to flank the SEALs from angles the mountain shooter could not cover. For 2 minutes, the sniper fire stopped. The SEALs were exposed, pinned down again as the enemy closed in from the south. Riggs saw them. First, multiple contacts, south side. They're using the dead ground. We're about to get pinched. Calloway swore under his breath. The sniper could not see this angle. The enemy was smart. They had figured out the sniper's limitations and were exploiting them. Calloway prepared to order his team to shift positions, knowing it would expose them to fire from other directions. Before he could speak, 3 shots rang out in rapid succession. Crack, crack, crack. 3 enemy fighters, the exact ones moving through the dead ground to flank the SEALs, dropped in 4 seconds. Impossible. There was no line of sight from the ridge to that position. Moss stared at the fallen fighters in disbelief. How did they see that? That angle is impossible from the ridge. Halstad spoke quietly, almost to himself. Unless they're moving. The implications hung in the air. Calloway processed it. You're saying there's a sniper out there, repositioning between shots, in complete darkness, across a mountain ridge, at combat speed. Halstad met his eyes. I'm saying whoever that is isn't following our doctrine. They're not staying static. They're fighting mobile. And they've been doing it long enough to know this terrain better than we know our own base. That was when it hit Calloway. This was not a guardian angel. This was not Overwatch from some friendly unit that happened to be in the area. This was someone who had been out here, living out here, fighting out here, someone who knew this terrain intimately because they had made it their home. The thought should have been comforting, but instead it filled him with unease. What kind of operator ended up living alone in enemy territory, fighting a solo war? The enemy fire was slackening as their numbers thinned and their morale wavered. The SEALs kept moving, closing the distance to the landing zone. Tennyson kept trying to clear the radio frequency, cycling through channels. Suddenly his face lit up. "LT, the jamming just stopped. I'm getting a clear signal." Calloway grabbed the handset. "Phantom 1 to Warhawk 6. We need that bird now." The response was immediate and clear. "Warhawk 6 copies. Helo is 4 minutes out. Expect heavy dust at LZ. We've got your posit." Calloway allowed himself a moment of hope. 4 minutes. They could make 4 minutes. He looked at the map on his wrist. The landing zone was 400 meters ahead. But between them and safety was one final obstacle. Tennyson had been working on the jamming issue and had triangulated its source. "LT, that jammer is in a stone hut, 400 meters east. It's heavily guarded. If you enjoyed learning about the courage and sacrifice that happens in the shadows, consider subscribing to hear more stories about the warriors who serve without recognition. These are the men and women who deserve to have their stories told." Calloway stared at the hut through his scope. There was no way to reach it. Too many enemy fighters around it. But if they could take out that jammer, they could call the helicopter in early, maybe shave crucial minutes off their wait time. He made a decision that was equal parts desperation and intuition. He pulled out an infrared strobe, a device visible only through night vision equipment. Moss saw what he was doing and grabbed his arm. "What are you doing?" Calloway shook him off gently, testing a theory. He aimed the strobe at the distant mountain ridge and activated it. 3 flashes, pause, 3 flashes, the old signal for friendly forces. Then he pointed the strobe directly at the stone hut where the jammer was located and held it steady. Moss hissed. "You're asking them to shoot a target they can't even see at 1,800 meters based on your mark. Are you insane?" Calloway kept the strobe aimed. "If they're watching us, they'll understand." The team waited. 10 seconds of silence. The enemy fire continued around them, but the sniper had gone quiet. 15 seconds, 20. Calloway began to doubt himself. Then it happened. Crack. A spark inside the stone hut. A secondary explosion as the jammer's electronics overloaded. Smoke poured from the windows. The enemy fighters around the hut scattered in confusion. Tennyson stared at his radio equipment in shock. They shot through the window. At 1,800 meters, at a target they couldn't even see. They just trusted your mark. The radio crackled to life with perfect clarity. "Phantom 1, Warhawk 6. We have your position clear. Helo inbound, 6 minutes." Calloway felt relief flood through him, but it was mixed with something else, awe and growing dread. Whoever was on that mountain was not just skilled. They were operating at a level that defied doctrine and training. They had just made a shot based purely on trust, hitting a target they could not possibly have seen, threading around through a window from nearly 2,000 meters away in darkness. Calloway kept the infrared strobe activated. He pointed it at the mountain and flashed a message in Morse code, a skill every SEAL learned but few used in the field. WHOAREYOU. He waited, holding his breath. For a long moment, nothing. Then, from the mountain, a single muzzle flash. Not a shot, just light. It blinked in a pattern. GETOUT. Not will extract with you. Not link up at the LZ. Just get out. Calloway lowered the strobe slowly. The message was clear. Whoever was up there was not coming with them. They were not asking for rescue. They wanted the SEALs to leave. The thought chilled him. What kind of operator told a SEAL team to abandon them? What kind of person chose to stay in hell when the door to escape was standing open? The enemy, sensing that the Americans were about to slip away, launched a final desperate assault. Fighters poured from every remaining position, screaming and firing on full automatic. It was chaos, a last-ditch attempt to overrun the SEAL position before the helicopter arrived. The sniper's fire became relentless. Shot after shot, eliminating threats with machine-like precision. An enemy fighter charged directly at Kane's position, and the machine gunner's weapon clicked empty. Before Kane could transition to his sidearm, the charging fighter dropped mid-stride, a round punching through his chest. Another enemy team tried to set up a truck-mounted machine gun to engage the incoming helicopter. 3 shots in 5 seconds took out the gunner, the loader, and the driver. The gun fell silent. The SEALs reached the landing zone, a flat clearing barely large enough for the MH-60 helicopter. They could hear the rotors now, the distinctive whop-whop-whop of the Black Hawk approaching fast and low. The helicopter crested the ridge and descended rapidly, its door gunners already engaging enemy positions with their miniguns. The SEALs formed a defensive perimeter, laying down covering fire as the bird touched down in a cloud of dust and debris. Hallstatt and Vaught helped Kemper toward the helicopter. Tennyson pulled Idris along, the translator stumbling but moving. Riggs and Kane provided rear security, firing controlled bursts to keep the enemy at bay. Moss and Calloway were the last to board, backing toward the helicopter while maintaining their fields of fire. As Calloway's boot hit the ramp, he turned and looked back at the mountain. Through the helicopter's door-mounted scope, he could see the sniper's position, a rocky ledge 1,900 meters away, barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness. Shell casings were scattered in the dirt, dozens of them, glinting in the faint light. But the shooter was gone. The position was abandoned, except there was something there, something left behind deliberately. Calloway zoomed the scope in as far as it would go. His blood turned to ice. It was a unit patch, half buried in the dirt and small stones. Even at this distance, even in poor light, he recognized it immediately. The design was unmistakable. He had seen it before, in intelligence briefings and classified after-action reports. It was the patch from Operation Emberlight. His mind raced. Emberlight had been a deep reconnaissance mission. 6 SEALs sent into denied territory to identify high-value targets for follow-on strikes. They had been compromised, surrounded. The weather had been too bad for air support. By the time the Quick Reaction Force could respond, the area was overrun. The military found remains. Enough to confirm kills. The file was closed. Every operator on that mission was declared killed in action. That was 3 years ago. The helicopter lifted off, banking hard to avoid ground fire. Calloway kept his eyes on the mountain until it disappeared from view. His mind would not stop working the problem. If everyone from Emberlight was dead, who had just saved their lives, who had been living on that mountain for 3 years, who had developed the skill to shoot like that, to move like that, to survive like that, and why had they never called for help? The questions had no answers, not yet. But Calloway knew one thing with absolute certainty. Someone from Operation Emberlight had survived. They were still out there, still fighting, still protecting American forces, even though the military had declared them dead and moved on. The thought filled him with a complex mix of emotions: gratitude, shame, and a growing horror at what it must have taken to survive, alone in enemy territory for over 1,000 days. Moss sat down next to him in the helicopter, shouting over the rotor noise. "We made it, thanks to whoever that was." Calloway nodded but did not respond. His eyes were locked on the mountains receding behind them. Somewhere in that vast darkness was an American operator who had been forgotten, abandoned, left for dead. And they were still in the fight. The helicopter touched down at the forward operating base 38 minutes later, rotors still spinning as the crew chief waved the team off. Calloway was the last to exit, his boots hitting the tarmac as the sun broke over the eastern peaks. The mountains glowed orange and gold in the early light, beautiful and indifferent to the violence that had occurred in their shadows. He stood for a moment, staring back at the ridgeline they had escaped from, knowing that somewhere up there, someone was watching the sunrise too. The base was already awake despite the early hour. Support personnel moved between buildings, mechanics worked on vehicles, and the smell of diesel fuel and cooking food drifted across the compound. To most of the people here, this was just another morning. They had no idea that 8 men had nearly died in the darkness, saved only by a ghost who refused to come home. Calloway felt the disconnect deeply. The normalcy of the base felt alien after what they had experienced. Chief Moss organized the team's immediate needs. Kemper was taken straight to the medical facility, where doctors began working on his shrapnel wounds. The bleeding had been controlled in the field, but he needed surgery to remove the fragments and repair damaged tissue. Idris was handed over to intelligence personnel, who would debrief him and arrange his relocation to a safe area. The translator kept looking back at the SEALs as he was led away, his eyes communicating gratitude that words could not express. He understood that these men had been willing to die to bring him out. The rest of the team was directed to a debriefing room in the operations center. It was a windowless space with fluorescent lighting, a large table, and chairs that had seen better days. Someone had brought in coffee and MRE breakfast rations. The coffee was terrible but hot, and Calloway drank it anyway, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. His hands were steady despite the adrenaline crash that was beginning to set in. Years of combat had taught him how to manage the physical aftermath of violence. They sat in silence for nearly 20 minutes, each man processing what had happened in his own way. Riggs cleaned his rifle methodically, field stripping it and inspecting each component with practiced precision. Kane stared at the wall, his jaw working as he chewed on nothing. Tennyson typed notes into a ruggedized tablet, documenting every detail while it was fresh in his memory. Vaught ate an MRE slowly, mechanically, not tasting it. Halstad checked and rechecked his medical kit, inventorying what he had used and what needed to be restocked. Moss sat with his arms crossed, eyes closed, but Calloway knew he was not sleeping. He was reviewing the engagement, analyzing every decision and every movement. The door opened and Colonel Wren Ashford entered. She was in her early 50s, a career intelligence officer with sharp eyes and a reputation for being impossible to deceive. She carried a tablet and a folder marked with classification stamps. Her expression was professionally neutral, but Calloway caught something else underneath. Concern, maybe even worry. She took a seat at the head of the table and looked at each man in turn. "Gentlemen, glad you made it back. I've read the initial after-action summary from the pilot. Sounds like you had a rough night." Her voice was calm, almost casual, but the tension in the room did not ease. Calloway nodded. "That's an understatement, Colonel. We walked into a prepared ambush. Someone leaked our route. The enemy was waiting for us with numbers and positioning that should have been impossible unless they knew exactly where we'd be." Ashford's expression hardened. "That's being investigated. Right now, I need your full debrief. Start from the beginning and don't leave anything out." Calloway walked her through the mission chronologically. The successful extraction of Idris, the movement through the valley, the ambush, the desperate fight behind the boulders, the ammunition running low, and the helicopter being too far away. He spoke in clipped, factual sentences, letting the events speak for themselves. The other team members added details and observations, building a complete picture of the engagement. When Calloway got to the part about the first shot from the mountain, Ashford leaned forward. "Stop there. Tell me exactly what happened." Calloway described it carefully. The different sound of the rifle, the enemy team leader dropping instantly, the subsequent shots that followed, each one hitting leadership targets with perfect precision, the way the enemy formation began to collapse under the pressure of an unseen marksman. Ashford interrupted. "Did you identify the shooter? Did you have any radio contact with them?" Calloway shook his head. "No radio contact. We tried to signal them with an infrared strobe. They responded, but only to confirm they understood our intent. They never identified themselves." Moss added, "Whoever it was, they were operating at a level I've never seen before. The distances, the accuracy, the tactical awareness. It was like they had a god's eye view of the entire battlefield." Halstad spoke up, his voice thoughtful. "They were also mobile. We identified at least 4 different firing positions across a 2-kilometer stretch of ridgeline, in full darkness, while maintaining perfect accuracy on moving targets at ranges exceeding 1,800 meters. That's not standard sniper protocol. That's someone who's made that mountain their home." Ashford made notes on her tablet, her stylus moving quickly. "Anything else? Any identifying markers, radio chatter, anything that could tell us who they were?" Calloway hesitated. This was the moment that would change everything. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in fabric. He had retrieved it from his kit before the debriefing. He unwrapped it carefully and placed the object on the table. It was a unit patch, faded and dirty, but still recognizable. The distinctive insignia was clear despite the wear. Ashford stared at it for a long moment. Her face went pale. She reached out and picked up the patch with hands that were not quite steady. "Where did you get this?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. Calloway explained. "After we extracted, I used the helicopter's optics to scan the sniper's position. They had left this behind, deliberately placed where we would see it." Ashford turned the patch over in her hands, examining it closely. She set it down and looked directly at Calloway. "Do you know what this is?" He nodded. "Operation Emberlight, 2022, 6-person SEAL reconnaissance element. They were compromised and surrounded. The file says they were all killed in action. The room was completely silent. Moss broke it first. All killed in action. Past tense. But someone from that team just saved our lives. Someone who's been living in those mountains for 3 years. Ashford did not respond immediately. She opened her folder and pulled out several documents, spreading them on the table. These are the classified after-action reports from Operation Emberlight. I need you to understand the context of what you found. She explained the mission in detail. Emberlight had been a deep reconnaissance operation, tasked with identifying Taliban leadership networks and weapons caches. The 6-person SEAL element had been inserted at night and had successfully gathered significant intelligence over a 2-week period. Then something went wrong. Their position was compromised. Enemy forces surrounded them in overwhelming numbers. The SEALs called for extraction, but weather conditions grounded all air support. Heavy storms, zero visibility. The helicopters could not fly. The team was on their own. They fought for 18 hours, moving through the mountains, trying to reach an alternative extraction point. Radio intercepts indicated they were taking casualties. Their last transmission came at 0430 hours, brief and broken. Contact, heavy casualties, cannot continue. Grid follows, then static. By the time the weather cleared and the quick reaction force could respond, 36 hours had passed. The QRF found the position, evidence of a sustained firefight, blood, equipment, and remains. Enough biological material to confirm 5 deaths through DNA analysis. Ashford pulled out a document with photographs. These are the 6 operators assigned to Emberlight. 5 bodies were recovered and identified. The 6th was never found. She pointed to a photo. Petty Officer First Class Nix Corwin. SEAL Team 3. Specialty: long-range reconnaissance and precision marksmanship. Status: missing, presumed dead. After 90 days with no contact and no evidence of survival, Corwin was administratively declared killed in action for purposes of benefits and records. Tennyson stared at the photograph, a lean face with intense eyes and a slight smile that did not quite reach those eyes. Corwin looked younger than the rest of the team, but there was something in the expression that suggested old wisdom. You're telling us that Corwin survived, alone, for 3 years, in enemy territory, with no support, no resupply, no communications. Ashford set down the documents. I'm telling you that, according to every official record, Nix Corwin is dead. But you just brought me evidence that strongly suggests otherwise. Vaught leaned forward. Why didn't Corwin call for extraction? Why stay out there for 3 years? Why not signal that they were alive? Those are very good questions, Ashford replied, and I don't have good answers. But there is context you need to understand. The original Emberlight mission was compromised from the inside. Someone with access to the operation order leaked it to enemy forces. That's how the team was ambushed. We never identified the source of the leak. The investigation went cold. The implications settled over the room like a weight. Riggs said what everyone was thinking. If Corwin survived and figured out the leak came from our side, they wouldn't trust us to extract them. They'd think any extraction call would be compromised just like the original mission. They'd expect to be sold out again. Ashford nodded slowly. That's the working theory. If Corwin believed the military had a security leak that got their entire team killed, they might have decided their best chance of survival was to disappear, to become a ghost. Moss rubbed his face with both hands. So Corwin's been out there for over 1,000 days, surviving off the land, scavenging equipment, fighting a one-person war against the Taliban, never knowing if calling for help would just bring another ambush. That's psychological torture, Halstead added quietly, and physical. The toll that kind of existence takes on a human body is extreme. Malnutrition, exposure, constant stress, untreated injuries. The fact that Corwin is still operational it's almost superhuman. Kane had been silent throughout the discussion. Now he spoke, his voice rough. They saved us. Even after we abandoned them. Even after the military declared them dead and moved on. They still protected us. Ashford met his eyes. Yes, they did. And that raises the question of what we do now. Calloway already knew what his answer would be. We bring them home. We send a recovery team. We extract Corwin and we give them the medical attention and support they need. Ashford shook her head. It's not that simple. If Corwin doesn't trust our communications, how do we coordinate an extraction? If they see a helicopter coming, they might think it's a trap. They might run. Or worse, they might engage it thinking it's an enemy asset. We can't just send a team in blind. We need a way to communicate that we know who they are and that we're coming to help. Tennyson suggested, what about another infrared signal? We could broadcast a message, identify Corwin by name, assure them it's a legitimate extraction. It might work, Ashford said, but it also might not. After 3 years of survival mode, Corwin's psychology is going to be fundamentally altered. Trust will be almost impossible. Paranoia will be deeply ingrained. Even if we send the right signals, there's no guarantee they'll believe us. Calloway thought about the Morse code message they had received. Get out. Those 2 words contained volumes. Corwin had not asked for help, had not requested extraction, had simply told them to leave. It was the message of someone who had made peace with their situation, someone who had accepted that they were never going home. The discussion continued for another hour. Plans were proposed and discarded. Ashford promised to escalate the issue to JSOC command and request authorization for a recovery operation. But even as they talked, Calloway felt a growing certainty that they would not find Nick's Corwin, not unless Corwin wanted to be found. After 3 years of evading enemy forces in their own backyard, Corwin had become something more than a SEAL operator. They had become part of the mountain itself. The debriefing ended and the team was dismissed to get rest and medical evaluations. Calloway stayed behind as the others filed out. He waited until the room was empty, except for him and Ashford. She looked at him expectantly. Something else, Lieutenant? He nodded. I want to go back. I want to lead the recovery team. If anyone has a chance of making contact with Corwin, it's us. We're the ones they saved. There's a connection there, even if it's just shared combat. Ashford considered this. I'll include your request in my report, but I'm not optimistic about approval. You just survived an ambush that nearly killed your entire team. Command is going to want you stateside for rest and retraining, not back in the field chasing ghosts. Calloway started to argue, but she held up a hand. I understand why you want this. I do. But you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that Nick's Corwin doesn't want to be found. They've had 3 years to call for help, and they haven't. That's a choice. He left the operations center and walked across the base to his temporary quarters. The sun was fully up now, heating the air and turning the dust golden. Other SEALs were beginning their day, heading to the gym or the chow hall or morning briefings. The routines of military life continued unchanged, but Calloway felt changed. He could not stop thinking about someone living alone in the mountains, fighting a war that no one else knew about, protecting people who thought they were dead. He pulled out his personal effects bag and found his satellite phone. The signal was good. He dialed a number he knew by heart. His wife answered on the second ring, her voice happy and surprised. Bridger, hi, I wasn't expecting to hear from you today. Is everything okay? He sat on the edge of his bunk and tried to find the words. Yeah, everything's fine. I needed to hear your voice. They talked for 15 minutes about normal things, their daughters, the leaking faucet in the kitchen that needed fixing, the school play coming up next month. It was grounding, a reminder of the world beyond this base, beyond the mountains, beyond the war. After he hung up, he lay back on his bunk and stared at the ceiling. Sleep should have come easily after the exhaustion of the night, but his mind would not stop working. He kept replaying the engagement in his head, analyzing every shot Corwin had taken. 87 shots. He had counted them while reviewing the helmet camera footage before the debriefing. 87 rounds fired, and every single one had hit its target. 0 misses. That was not normal. Even elite snipers had miss rates, especially under combat conditions with moving targets and poor visibility. But Corwin could not afford to miss. Every round fired was a round that had to be scavenged or conserved. Ammunition in enemy territory was precious. You did not waste shots. You did not fire unless you were certain of the hit. 3 years of that kind of discipline would forge someone into something extraordinary, or it would break them. Calloway was not sure which had happened to Nick's Corwin, maybe both. He must have fallen asleep because he woke to someone knocking on his door. He checked his watch. 4 hours had passed. He sat up, feeling the stiffness in his muscles and the dull ache in his shoulder where he had slammed into a boulder during the firefight. Come in. Moss entered, followed by Halstead and Tennyson. They looked as tired as he felt. Moss closed the door behind them. "We've been talking. About Corwin. About what happens next." Calloway waited. Moss continued. "If Command approves a recovery operation, we want to be part of it. All of us. This isn't just about following orders or completing a mission. This is personal. Corwin saved our lives. We owe them," Halstead added. "And from a practical standpoint, we're the best option. We've already established a communication method with Corwin. They responded to our IR strobe. They might respond to us again when they wouldn't respond to anyone else." Tennyson pulled out his tablet. "I've been working on a communication protocol, a series of signals using IR strobes and Morse code that would identify us specifically, reference the engagement we shared, and request a meeting. It's not perfect, but it's more likely to get Corwin's attention than a generic extraction call." Calloway looked at the three of them. "You understand that Command might not authorize this. They might decide that Corwin is too far gone, too unpredictable, too risky to recover. They might just update the records and move on." "We understand," Moss said, "but we have to try. If we don't, who will?" The question hung in the air. Calloway made his decision. "All right. We make our case to Ashford and to Command. We volunteer for the recovery op. We do this the right way through proper channels. But we make it clear that we're committed." The others nodded. It was settled. The next 30 hours were a blur of activity. Medical evaluations, written after-action reports, interviews with intelligence analysts who wanted every detail of the engagement. Calloway submitted his formal request to lead the recovery operation, backed by statements from every member of his team. Ashford forwarded the request up the chain of command, along with her own recommendation that it be approved. Then they waited. Kemper was released from medical with his arm in a sling and orders to avoid strenuous activity for 2 weeks. He immediately began physical therapy, determined to be ready if the recovery op was approved. Idris was relocated to a safe house in another country, his intelligence proving valuable enough to warrant long-term protection. The translator had asked to speak with Calloway before he left. Through an interpreter, Idris had said something that stuck with Calloway. "You were all ready to die for me, a stranger. But someone else was ready to die for all of you. That person is not a stranger to God." On the second day after the engagement, Ashford called Calloway to her office. She looked tired. "Command has made their decision. You're not going to like it." His stomach sank. "They denied the op." She shook her head. "Not exactly. They're authorizing a recovery operation, but they're not sending your team. They're sending a dedicated personnel recovery unit with specialized training in hostile extractions. Your team is being rotated stateside for rest and debrief at JSOC headquarters." Calloway felt anger rise in his chest. "That's a mistake. Corwin won't respond to strangers. They responded to us because we were there. We were in the fight together. Sending a different team is going to spook them." Ashford held up a hand. "I agree with you. I told Command exactly that. But the decision is made. The recovery unit deploys in 72 hours. Your team flies out in 24. I'm sorry, Bridger. I fought for you on this." He left her office feeling hollow. The rest of the team took the news hard. Moss punched a wall and had to have his hand x-rayed. Kane went silent and stayed that way for hours. Vaught started drinking and had to be pulled away from the bar by Riggs and Tennyson. They all felt the same thing. They were abandoning Corwin a second time, first by declaring them dead, and now by walking away when they finally had a chance to bring them home. The night before they flew out, Calloway could not sleep. He got dressed and walked to the base perimeter, to a section of fence that looked out toward the mountains. The peaks were dark silhouettes against a star-filled sky. Somewhere out there, Nix Corwin was bedding down for another night, weapon close at hand, sleeping light and waking at every sound, living a life that no human should have to live. He wondered if Corwin looked at the base sometimes, at the lights and the activity, and felt anything. Longing, resentment, nothing at all. Moss found him there an hour later. Can't sleep either. They stood in silence for a while. Finally, Moss spoke. "You think they'll find Corwin?" Calloway shook his head. "No. I think Corwin will see them coming from miles away and disappear. 3 years of survival instinct doesn't turn off just because someone flashes a friendly signal." Moss agreed. So what do? We go home, we file our reports. We tell Corwin's story to anyone who will listen. We make sure people know what happened out there. The flight home was long and uncomfortable. Military transport planes were not built for comfort. Calloway spent most of the flight reviewing his notes and the footage from their helmet cameras. He had compiled a detailed analysis of every shot Corwin had taken, every position they had fired from, every tactical decision they had made. It painted a picture of someone who had evolved beyond standard SEAL training into something adapted specifically for solo survival and combat in mountain terrain. When they landed stateside, there were more debriefings. Isaac wanted every detail. Intelligence analysts studied the unit patch under magnification and confirmed it was authentic, matching materials and construction methods from the original Emberlight mission. Forensic linguists analyzed the Morse code message, "Get out," looking for psychological indicators in the choice of words and timing. Tactical experts built terrain models and tried to identify where Corwin might be operating from, where they might have cached supplies, how they might be surviving. 3 weeks after the engagement, word came back from the recovery unit. They had deployed to the area. They had searched the mountains. They had broadcast messages on every frequency. They had used infrared strobes and even loudspeakers in some areas, calling Corwin by name and promising safe extraction. They found evidence of recent human activity, fire pits, fighting positions, shell casings, but no Corwin. After 2 weeks of searching, the unit was recalled. The operation was classified as unsuccessful. Nick's Corwin remained missing in action. Calloway received the news in his team room at Virginia Beach. He sat alone for a long time, staring at the mission board where photos of fallen teammates were displayed. He thought about adding Corwin's photo, but something stopped him. Corwin was not fallen. Corwin was still out there, still fighting. The status might read MIA, but Calloway knew the truth. Nick's Corwin had chosen the mountain over the military, had chosen solitude over the risk of betrayal. It was a tragedy, but it was also a kind of freedom. That night, he went home to his family. His daughters ran to meet him at the door, and he held them tight, breathing in the smell of their shampoo and feeling their small arms around his neck. His wife watched from the doorway with tears in her eyes. After the girls went to bed, he told her everything, about the ambush, about Corwin, about the choice between saving yourself and trusting a system that had already failed you once. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she took his hand. "You did everything you could. Some people can't be saved because they don't want to be saved." But that was not quite right, and he knew it. Corwin did not need saving. Corwin had saved themselves, had survived when survival should have been impossible, had continued the mission when everyone else had given up. What Corwin needed was recognition, acknowledgement, the simple truth that they mattered, that their sacrifice mattered, that they had not been forgotten. Calloway made a decision. He went to the SEAL Memorial Wall at the Naval Special Warfare Base. Corwin's name was there, engraved in stone with a date of death from 3 years ago. He stood in front of it for a long time. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something he had kept, a small object wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it carefully. It was not the original unit patch that was in an evidence locker somewhere, but he had ordered a replica, an exact copy made from the same materials. He placed it at the base of the memorial, beneath Corwin's name. Other SEALs passed by and saw what he was doing. Some of them knew the story. Word had spread through the community despite the classification. A few of them stopped and stood with him. Moss arrived with the rest of the team. They had not planned to meet here, but somehow they all ended up in the same place at the same time. They stood together in front of the wall, 8 men who owed their lives to someone they had never met, someone who refused to come home. Riggs broke the silence. "Think Corwin knows we tried?" Calloway nodded. "Yeah, I think Corwin knows everything that happens in those mountains. They're watching, always watching," Halstad added, "and protecting, even now, even after we left. They're still protecting people who don't know they exist." The thought was both comforting and deeply sad. They stood there until the sun set. As darkness fell, Calloway looked east, toward the ocean and beyond it, toward the mountains on the other side of the world. Somewhere in that darkness, Nix. Corwin was settling into another night, checking weapons, listening to the wind, planning for tomorrow, living a life that existed in the spaces between official records and acknowledged reality, a ghost who was more real than most people would ever be. 6 months later, intelligence reports began filtering through JSOC. Reports from various sources in Afghanistan, local fighters telling stories about a phantom sniper who appeared without warning and disappeared just as quickly. Taliban commanders found dead from impossible shots. Patrols ambushed by an enemy they never saw. Weapons caches destroyed by precision fire from extreme range. The reports were fragmentary and often contradictory, but they all pointed to the same conclusion. Someone was out there, operating alone, conducting a one-person guerrilla campaign against enemy forces. The reports never mentioned the sniper's identity or allegiance. They simply referred to the figure as a ghost, a demon, a curse on the mountains. JSOC analysts compiled the reports and plotted the incidents on a map. The pattern was clear. All the activity centered around a specific area of the Hindu Kush, the same area where Operation Emberlight had been compromised, the same mountains where Nix Corwin had been left behind. Calloway was called in to review the intelligence. He sat in a secure facility and read through report after report. Each one added another piece to the puzzle. Corwin was not just surviving. Corwin was thriving, had turned survival into a mission, was single-handedly disrupting enemy operations across an entire region. It was unprecedented. One operator with no support, no resupply, no communications, conducting sustained combat operations for years. It should not have been possible, but the evidence was undeniable. The analyst briefing him was a young captain who spoke with academic precision. Based on the pattern of activity and the tactical sophistication of the operations, we assess with high confidence that this is a trained Western Special Operations soldier. The marksmanship, the terrain utilization, the target selection, it all points to advanced training. We believe this is your petty officer Corwin. The captain paused. The question is, what do we do about it? Calloway had thought about that question for months. Nothing. We do nothing. We leave Corwin alone. We respect their choice, and we learn from their example. The captain looked surprised. But they're one of ours. We have a responsibility to recover them. Calloway shook his head. We had a responsibility 3 years ago. We failed that responsibility. Now Corwin has built a new life. Maybe not a life any of us would choose, but it's their life. They're still fighting, still serving, in their own way. Who are we to tell them that's wrong? The discussion ended there. The reports continued to come in, less frequently now, but steady. Corwin had become part of the landscape, a permanent fixture in the mythology of the region, and perhaps that was fitting. Some warriors were meant for parades and medals and homecomings. Others were meant for the shadows, for the lonely places where the only witnesses were the mountains and the sky. Nix Corwin had become the latter, a ghost who protected without being seen, who fought without being acknowledged, who served without ever coming home. Late one night, Calloway sat at his desk and began to write. Not an official report, but something personal. A letter that would never be sent because there was no address to send it to. He wrote about gratitude and respect, about the debt that could never be repaid, about how 8 men were alive because one person had refused to give up, even when everyone else had given up on them. He wrote until his hand cramped and his eyes burned. Then he sealed the letter in an envelope and placed it in his safe, alongside his important documents and his will. Maybe someday it would matter. Maybe someday someone would read it and understand. The last intelligence report came in 14 months after the initial engagement. It described an incident near the Pakistan border. A coalition patrol had been ambushed by a large Taliban force. They were pinned down and taking casualties. Air support was delayed by weather. The situation was critical. Then, according to the patrol leader's report, shots began coming from a nearby ridgeline. Long-range precision fire. Enemy fighters dropped one by one. The ambush collapsed. The coalition patrol was able to break contact and reach safety. When they searched the ridge later, they found shell casings in a small cairn of stones. On top of the cairn was a piece of cloth, faded, weathered, but still recognizable as an American flag. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, please share this with someone who understands the cost of service. These are not just stories. They are testaments to the warriors who never stop fighting, even when the world stops watching. Calloway read the report 3 times. Then he picked up his phone and called Moss. You see the latest intel. Moss had. They're still out there. still protecting people, still flying the flag in their own way. Calloway felt something settle in his chest. Peace, maybe, or acceptance. Yeah, they are. And maybe that's enough. Maybe knowing that someone is still in the fight, still holding the line in the places no one else can reach. Maybe that's all we need. He hung up and walked to his window. It was dark outside, late evening on the East Coast. But somewhere on the other side of the world, the sun was rising over mountains that held secrets the military would never acknowledge. And in those mountains, a solitary figure was beginning another day. Checking equipment, planning movements, watching for threats. Living a life defined not by what had been taken away, but by what could never be taken. Purpose, mission, identity. Nix Corwin was still in the fight. And somehow, that made all the difference. 36 hours after the intelligence report about the flag on the cairn, Calloway received a call that changed everything. It was from Colonel Ashford. Her voice was tight with controlled urgency. "Lieutenant, I need you at JSOC headquarters immediately. We have a situation." He was on a plane within 3 hours, flying north from Virginia Beach to Fort Bragg. The tone in her voice had told him this was not routine. Something had happened, something significant. When he arrived at the Secure Operations Center, he found Ashford in a conference room with a half-dozen senior officers and intelligence analysts. The mood was tense. Ashford gestured him to a seat and pulled up a series of satellite images on the main screen. These were taken 48 hours ago. The images showed a mountainous region that Calloway recognized immediately. The same area where his team had been ambushed. The same ridgelines where Nix Corwin had provided covering fire. Ashford zoomed in on a particular section. "This is a Taliban staging area. We've been monitoring it for months. Heavy weapons, ammunition, supplies for major operations. It's been a priority target, but the terrain makes direct assault problematic and airstrikes risk civilian casualties in nearby villages." She advanced to the next image. This was taken 12 hours later. The staging area was destroyed, completely. Supply caches burning, weapons disabled, casualties estimated at 30 to 40 fighters. One of the analysts spoke up. Initial assessment suggested coalition airstrike, but flight records show no assets in the area during the relevant time window. We also detected no missile signatures, no bomb damage patterns consistent with airdropped ordnance. This was ground action, but there's no record of any coalition or Afghan forces conducting operations in this sector. Ashford turned to Calloway. "The Taliban is claiming they were attacked by a ghost. Their fighters are saying one person did this. One person systematically destroyed an entire staging area over the course of 6 hours." Calloway felt his pulse quicken. "Corwin," Ashford nodded. "We believe so. But it gets more complicated. The Taliban has put out a reward, a significant one. They want this ghost found and killed. They're mobilizing resources across 3 provinces. This has become personal for them. They see it as a matter of honor and credibility. One person has humiliated them repeatedly, and they cannot let that stand." She paused. "We estimate they're deploying between 200 and 300 fighters specifically to hunt Corwin." The room was silent. Calloway processed the implications. Those numbers were overwhelming. Even for someone with Corwin's skills, being hunted by that many people across familiar terrain would eventually result in capture or death. It was not a matter of if, but when. One of the senior officers, a General Calloway did not recognize, spoke from the head of the table. "Which brings us to why. You're here, Lieutenant. We're authorizing another recovery operation. And this time, we're sending your team." Calloway felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Relief, determination, but also concern. "Sir, with respect, the previous recovery op failed because Corwin didn't want to be found. What makes you think this time will be different?" The general's expression was grave. "Because this time, Corwin doesn't have a choice. With 300 fighters hunting them, their ability to evade is going to be severely compromised. They're going to need extraction whether they want it or not. Your mission is to reach Corwin before the Taliban does." Ashford brought up a tactical map. "We've analyzed the pattern of Corwin's activities over the past 18 months. We've identified a likely area of operations, approximately 50 square kilometers. Your team will insert here, at the southern edge. You'll move north using the same communication protocols you established during your first encounter: infrared strobes, Morse code, references to the engagement you shared. We're gambling that Corwin will recognize you and will trust you more than they'd trust anyone else. One of the analysts added, "Time is critical. Taliban forces are already moving into the area. You'll be operating in an extremely hostile environment with limited support. This is a recovery mission, not a combat operation. Get in, make contact, extract Corwin, and get out." The general stood. "Your team deploys in 18 hours. You'll brief them personally. This mission is classified at the highest level. Official records will show a routine training exercise. Questions. Calloway had 100 questions, but only one that mattered. What if Corwin refuses extraction even with Taliban forces closing in? What if they'd rather take their chances alone than trust us?" The general's face hardened. "Then you use whatever means necessary to bring them home. Corwin is a United States service member who has been missing in action for over 3 years. We are not leaving them behind again, even if that means bringing them home against their will." Calloway understood. This was not a request. This was an order. He spent the next 12 hours preparing. His team was recalled from various assignments and briefed on the mission parameters. Moss, Halstead, Riggs, Tennyson, Kane, Vogt, and Kemper all volunteered immediately. Kemper's shoulder had healed well, and he had been cleared for full duty. They spent hours reviewing intelligence, studying terrain maps, and rehearsing communication protocols. They packed light. Speed and mobility would be essential. Heavy weapons and equipment would slow them down. The insert was scheduled for 200 hours. They would fly in on a stealth-modified Black Hawk, land in a remote valley, and move on foot to the target area. The helicopter would extract them at a designated point 72 hours later. If they missed the extraction window, they would have to move to an alternate site and wait for another opportunity. It was a tight timeline made tighter by the number of enemy forces in the area. The flight into country was tense. Each man dealt with pre-mission nerves in his own way. Riggs cleaned his weapon for the 5th time. Kane stared out the window at darkness. Halstead reviewed his medical supplies. Tennyson checked and rechecked the communication equipment. Vaught slept, or pretended to. Moss sat with his eyes closed, mentally rehearsing the mission profile. Calloway thought about Nick's Corwin, alone in the mountains, possibly unaware that hundreds of fighters were converging on their position, possibly aware and preparing for a final stand. They landed in a valley at 01:47 hours. The helicopter touched down just long enough for the team to jump out, then lifted off immediately and disappeared into the night. The sound of rotors faded quickly, leaving them in complete silence except for the wind. They were alone in hostile territory, just like Corwin had been for 3 years. The difference was they had a way out. Corwin had not. They moved through the darkness using night vision, navigating by terrain features and GPS. The mountains were steep and unforgiving. Loose rocks shifted underfoot. The altitude made breathing harder. They maintained tactical spacing and noise discipline, communicating with hand signals. After 3 hours of movement, they reached a position overlooking the target area. They set up an observation post and waited for daylight. Dawn came slowly, the sky turning from black to deep blue to pale gold. As light spread across the mountains, Calloway used binoculars to scan the terrain. He was looking for any sign of human activity, smoke from a fire, movement on ridgelines, anything that might indicate where Corwin was operating from. For the first hour, he saw nothing. Then Riggs touched his arm and pointed. There, on a distant ridge, a reflection. Brief, gone in an instant. But it had been there. Glass. Maybe a scope or binoculars. Someone was watching. Calloway pulled out the infrared strobe and activated it. Even though it was daylight and the effect would be minimal, he flashed the same pattern they had used during the ambush. 3 flashes, pause, 3 flashes. Then he added a message in Morse code. Phantom 1 to Ghost Ridge. Friendly forces. Request contact. He repeated the message 3 times and waited. Nothing. No response. He tried again an hour later. Still nothing. Moss moved up beside him. They might not be able to see us from their position, or they might think it's a trap. Calloway agreed. We need to move closer, make ourselves visible, take the risk. They broke down the observation post and began moving toward the ridge where they had seen the reflection. It took 4 hours to cross the distance. The terrain was difficult, and they had to move carefully to avoid being spotted by any Taliban patrols in the area. They reached the base of the ridge and began climbing. Halfway up, Tennyson stopped and pointed at the ground. Calloway looked down and saw it, a single shell casing, weathered but not old. He picked it up and examined it, 50 caliber, match grade. This was a sniper position. They were on the right track. They continued climbing, finding more signs of use. Shallow scrapes in the rock where someone had lain prone. Small cairns of stones arranged as range markers. This was a fighting position that had been used repeatedly. They reached the top of the ridge and found the position itself. It was expertly camouflaged, nearly invisible until you were right on top of it. A shallow depression in the rocks with sight lines covering 3 different valleys. Shell casings were scattered in the dirt, partially buried, hundreds of them. This was not just a position. This was home. Calloway knelt and examined the area more closely. There were signs of long-term occupation. A small area where fires had been built, though not recently. Rocks arranged to create a windbreak. Even a crude shelter made from scavenged materials. But no Corwin. The position was abandoned. Halstad was examining the shell casings. These are relatively fresh. Days old, maybe a week. Corwin was here recently, but moved on. Riggs pointed to tracks in the dirt. Single person. Heading northwest. They're traveling light, maybe 15 kilos of gear. Calloway made the decision. We follow the tracks. Stay sharp. If we can find these tracks, so can the Taliban. They moved northwest, following the faint trail left by someone who clearly knew how to minimize their signature, but could not eliminate it entirely. The tracks led them along ridgelines and through narrow defiles. Whoever they were following was moving with purpose, not randomly. After 2 hours, the tracks descended into a valley that offered better concealment. They were getting close. Calloway could feel it. Kane, on point, suddenly froze and raised his fist. Everyone stopped. He signaled. Trip wire. Calloway moved forward carefully and examined what Kane had found. A thin wire stretched across the path at ankle height. Following it, he found the other end tied to a carefully balanced pile of rocks. A simple alarm system. Someone would know if the wire was disturbed. He used his knife to carefully cut the wire and secure both ends so the rocks would not fall. They continued forward even more cautiously. 50 meters further, Riggs found another trap. This one was more sophisticated, a pressure plate made from stacked rocks that would collapse if stepped on, creating noise and possibly triggering a secondary device. They disarmed it and moved on. Corwin had turned this entire area into a defensive network. Every approach was monitored or trapped. It was impressive and also deeply sad. This was the mindset of someone who trusted nothing and no one, who had learned that survival meant constant vigilance and preparation for attack from any direction. They entered a narrow canyon, and Calloway felt the tactical situation shift. They were exposed here, limited sight lines, poor fields of fire. If they were going to be ambushed, this would be the place. He signaled for the team to spread out and move slowly. They were halfway through the canyon when a voice called out from above. It was not loud, but it carried clearly in the still air. That's far enough. Everyone froze. Calloway scanned the canyon walls, but could not see the speaker. The voice came again, flat and emotionless. You've been following me for 6 hours. You disarmed 2 of my early warning systems. You're either very good or very lucky. Either way, you need to turn around and leave. Now. Calloway recognized something in the voice. Exhaustion. Not physical, but mental. The weariness of someone who had been fighting for too long. He called back, keeping his hands visible and away from his weapon. Petty Officer Corwin, my name is Lieutenant Bridger Calloway. We met before. You saved my team's life during an ambush 18 months ago. We've come to bring you home. Silence. Then the voice responded. I don't have a home, and you shouldn't be here. This area is about to become very dangerous. Calloway pressed on. We know about the Taliban mobilization. 300 fighters looking for you. That's why we're here. To extract you before they find you. Laughter echoed off the canyon walls. Cold and bitter. You think I need extraction? I've been dealing with these mountains and these people for 3 years. I know every cave, every trail, every hiding place. They won't find me. Moss spoke up. With respect, you can evade 10 fighters or 50 fighters, but 300 covering every approach using drones and thermal imaging, that changes the math. Eventually they'll box you in. You know it, and we know it. More silence. Longer this time. Then Corwin's voice came back, quieter. Why do you care? The government declared me dead. They closed my file. They moved on. Why come back now? Calloway chose his words carefully. Because you never gave up on us. When we were surrounded and out of ammunition and facing certain death, you fought for us. You gave us a chance to survive. Now, we're returning the favor. We're not leaving without you. A figure appeared on the canyon rim, silhouetted against the sky, weapon held ready but not aimed directly at them. Calloway could not make out details, but he could see the posture, tense, ready to fight or flee. The figure was smaller than he expected, lean to the point of gauntness. Wearing a mixture of military and civilian clothing, all of it faded and patched, face obscured by a scarf and goggles. This was Nix Corwin, not the person from the official photos. That person was 3 years and a lifetime of survival ago. This was who Corwin had become. Corwin's voice carried down to them. You shouldn't have come. I didn't ask for rescue, and I don't want it. I have a mission here. I'm disrupting enemy operations. I'm protecting coalition forces by keeping the Taliban focused on hunting me instead of planning attacks. What I'm doing here matters. Calloway understood the logic, but he also understood the cost. You're one person against an entire insurgency. You can't keep this up forever. Eventually you'll make a mistake, or you'll run out of luck. And then everything you've accomplished will end. Come home. Rest. Recover. If you want to come back and continue the fight, you can do that. But do it with support. With resources. With a team. Corwin was silent for a long moment, then the figure moved, disappeared from the rim. For a second, Calloway thought they had lost the contact. Then Corwin appeared at ground level, having descended the canyon wall with remarkable speed. Up close, Calloway could see the toll 3 years had taken. Corwin was dangerously thin, weathered skin, hands scarred and calloused, eyes that were constantly moving, assessing threats, looking for exits. This was someone who had not relaxed in 3 years, someone who lived in perpetual combat mode. Corwin studied each member of the team in turn, finally spoke. You're the ones from the valley, the ambush. Calloway nodded. We are, and we owe you our lives. Corwin's expression did not change. You don't owe me anything. I did what any operator would do. Protected friendlies and contact. Standard ROE. Moss stepped forward carefully. There was nothing standard about what you did. 87 shots, 87 hits. From impossible distances in impossible conditions. You didn't just protect us. You orchestrated an entire counterattack from 2 kilometers away. That's not standard. That's legendary. Something flickered in Corwin's eyes. Not pride, maybe pain. I had a lot of time to practice. Not much else to do up here. Halstad, speaking gently as he would to a spooked animal, you need medical attention, malnutrition, probably parasites, untreated injuries. Let us help you. Corwin shook their head. I've managed this long. I'll manage longer. Calloway decided to change tactics. He pulled out a tablet and brought up a file. Operation Emberlight. Your team. We know what happened. We know about the leak. We know why you didn't trust extraction calls. Corwin went very still. The weapon came up slightly, not quite aimed, but ready. You don't know anything. Calloway continued carefully. We know someone with access to your op order leaked it to the enemy. We know your team was ambushed because of that leak. We know you survived and decided staying hidden was safer than risking another betrayal. And we know you've been fighting alone ever since because you couldn't trust that the next extraction call wouldn't be compromised too. Corwin's hands tightened on the weapon. Your point. Calloway met their eyes. My point is that the leak was identified. The person responsible was caught. They're in prison. The security failure that killed your team has been fixed. The risk you were avoiding no longer exists. Coming home is not a betrayal of your team's memory. It's honoring their sacrifice by surviving, by continuing to serve, just not alone. The silence stretched out. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called. The wind moved through the canyon. Corwin stood like a statue, processing information. Finally spoke. You're lying. trying to manipulate me into compliance. Ashford had prepared for this. Calloway pulled up documents on the tablet, classified court-martial records, names, dates, evidence chains. He held it out so Corwin could see. It's all here. Everything that happened after your team was declared KIA. The investigation, the arrest, the conviction, it's real. Corwin took the tablet with obvious reluctance, read through the documents slowly. Several minutes passed, finally handed it back. Even if that's true, it doesn't change anything. I've built a life here, a mission. I can't just walk away from it. Tennyson spoke up. What life? Sleeping in the dirt, eating whatever you can scavenge or kill, never trusting anyone, never resting, always one step ahead of death. That's not a life, that's existence. And you deserve better. Corwin's voice turned hard. You think I don't know what I'm doing. You think I'm here because I can't leave. I'm here because I choose to be, because someone has to be, because there's work that needs doing, and I'm the one doing it. Vaught responded quietly. Then let us help you do it. Come back with us. Get medical attention. Get proper equipment and supplies. Brief command on what you've learned about enemy operations in this area. Your knowledge is invaluable. Then, if you want, you can return. But you'll return as part of a team, with support, with a plan, not as a ghost living on borrowed time. Calloway could see Corwin wavering. The arguments were penetrating, but there was still resistance, still the deep-seated fear that had kept them alive for 3 years. He made his final play. Nix, your team died believing they failed the mission. They died thinking they had been abandoned and forgotten. But you survived. You completed the mission. You've gathered more intelligence and conducted more successful operations than anyone thought possible. You've become a legend. But legends are only valuable if they come home and share what they've learned. If you die out here, everything you've accomplished dies with you. If you come home, you can teach the next generation. You can make sure what happened to your team never happens to anyone else. The words hung in the air. Corwin looked at each member of the team again, looked at the mountains around them, looked down at their hands, scarred and worn. When they spoke again, their voice was different, smaller, almost vulnerable. I don't know if I can. I don't know if I remember how to be around people, how to trust, how to be anything other than this. Halstad stepped forward slowly. We'll help you remember. One step at a time. You don't have to do this alone anymore. Corwin's shoulders sagged, the weapon lowered. In that moment, Calloway saw the exhaustion that had been hidden behind the tactical awareness and survival instinct. This was someone who had been carrying an impossible weight for 3 years and was finally admitting they could not carry it anymore. All right, I'll come with you. But I have conditions. Calloway nodded. Name them. Corwin laid them out. I want full debriefs with intelligence. I want everything I've learned documented and put to use. I want assurances that the families of my teammates know what happened, know that their deaths were not in vain. And I want the people responsible for the leak held accountable publicly, not just court-martialed quietly. Their names and their crimes need to be on record. Calloway agreed to all of it. Done. You have my word. Anything else? One more thing. Corwin gestured to the mountains. I've been working with some of the local villagers, people who are caught between the Taliban and coalition forces, people who just want to survive. I have caches of supplies hidden in 3 locations: food, medical supplies, things I've scavenged or taken from Taliban supplies. I want those caches given to the villagers. They need it more than I do now. Calloway felt respect deepen. Even in survival mode, Corwin had been thinking of others. We'll make it happen, I promise. Corwin nodded slowly. Then let's go before I change my mind. The team formed up around Corwin, not as guards, but as protection. They moved back through the canyon, disarming the remaining traps as they went. Corwin moved differently now, still alert, but not quite as rigid. Like something fundamental had shifted. They climbed out of the valley and headed toward the extraction point, moving carefully through terrain that might contain Taliban patrols. They had covered about half the distance when Riggs signaled contact. Multiple fighters, moving along a parallel ridge. Approximately 20 hostiles, spread out in a search formation. They were looking for something. Looking for Corwin. The team went to ground, using rocks and terrain features for concealment. Calloway watched the fighters through binoculars. They were well armed and moving with tactical discipline. This was not a random patrol. This was part of the organized hunt. The fighters moved past without detecting them. After they were clear, the team continued, but they encountered more patrols as they got closer to the extraction point. The Taliban presence was heavy and getting heavier. Corwin whispered to Calloway, "They're converging on this area. Someone figured out this is where I usually operate from. We need to move fast." Calloway agreed and increased their pace. They reached the extraction point with 2 hours to spare before the scheduled pickup. It was a flat area on a ridgeline, barely large enough for a helicopter to land, but the best option in the terrain. They set up a defensive perimeter and waited. Tennyson established communication with the extraction bird. All systems were go. Thus, helicopter would arrive exactly on time. 30 minutes before extraction, they saw movement on multiple ridges around them. Taliban fighters, lots of them, closing in from 3 directions. They had been spotted or tracked. The enemy knew where they were. Moss did a quick count. At least 60 hostiles that we can see. Probably more we can't. They're gonna hit us right as the bird comes in. Calloway made rapid tactical decisions. Riggs, Kane, northeast sector. Moss, Vogt, southwest. Halstad, you're on Corwin. Keep them safe and ready to move. Tennyson, stay on comms with the bird. Everyone else, we hold this position until extraction arrives. Controlled fire. Make every shot count. The Taliban opened fire first. Rounds began impacting around the perimeter. The SEALs returned fire with disciplined bursts. They had better training and better equipment, but the enemy had numbers and was willing to take casualties. It was going to be close. Kane's machine gun hammered away at enemy positions, forcing fighters to stay in cover. Riggs picked off targets with his rifle, eliminating anyone who tried to flank. But there were too many. For every fighter they dropped, 2 more appeared. Corwin had been sitting behind cover, weapon across their lap, but not engaging. Then they stood, moved to a firing position, and brought their rifle to bear. The weapon was a strange hybrid, built from parts of different rifles and heavily modified. But in Corwin's hands it was devastatingly effective. Shot after shot, each one a hit. Machine gunners dropped. Spotters with radios were eliminated. A fighter setting up an RPG was taken down before he could fire. The Taliban advance faltered as their leadership was systematically removed. Calloway found himself fighting alongside the Ghost who had saved them 18 months ago. There was something surreal about it. Corwin moved with fluid efficiency, transitioning between targets without wasted motion. This was someone who had been doing this alone for 3 years and had perfected every aspect of individual combat. The SEALs were excellent, but Corwin was something else, something honed to a razor edge by necessity and isolation. The sound of helicopter rotors cut through the gunfire. The Black Hawk came in fast and low, flaring hard as it reached the landing zone. The door gunners opened up with their miniguns, suppressing enemy positions and giving the team covering fire. Calloway shouted above the noise, "Move! Move! Move!" The team began falling back to the helicopter, maintaining fire as they went. Corwin was the first to the bird, despite being the one most recently added to the formation. Old habits. Always secure the extraction point first. They loaded quickly. Halstad literally pushed Corwin into the helicopter when they hesitated at the threshold. Moss and Riggs were last aboard, firing controlled bursts as they backed up the ramp. The helicopter lifted off even as rounds pinged off its armored hull. They gained altitude rapidly, banking away from the ridgeline and the enemy fighters below. Within seconds, they were out of range and accelerating towards safety. Inside the helicopter, no one spoke for several minutes. They were all processing what had just happened, the successful contact, the firefight, the extraction. Corwin sat with their back against the bulkhead, eyes closed, breathing deeply. Calloway sat across from them and saw what he had not been able to see during the chaos. Corwin was shaking, not from fear but from the release of 3 years of tension. The armor that had kept them alive was finally coming down, and the human underneath was emerging. Halstad moved to check Corwin's vital signs. Corwin allowed it without protest, which told Calloway how exhausted they really were. Halstad worked quietly, doing a basic medical assessment. After several minutes, he looked at Calloway and shook his head slightly. The message was clear. Corwin needed serious medical attention. They had survived, but at a tremendous cost. The flight to base took 40 minutes. When they landed, medical personnel were waiting with a gurney. Corwin resisted. "I can walk." Halstad put a hand on their shoulder. "I know you can, but you don't have to. Not anymore." That simple statement seemed to break something loose. Corwin's face crumpled. For the first time in 3 years, they allowed themselves to be vulnerable. They lay back on the gurney and let others take care of them. Calloway watched as the medical team wheeled Corwin toward the hospital facility. Colonel Ashford appeared at his side. "You did it. You brought them home." Calloway felt no sense of triumph, only relief and sadness for what Corwin had endured. The debrief took place over the following weeks. Corwin was hospitalized for 12 days. Severe malnutrition, parasitic infections, untreated wounds, dental problems, vitamin deficiencies. The list went on. But the doctors said Corwin would make a full physical recovery. The psychological recovery would take much longer. When Corwin was stable enough, the intelligence debriefs began. They spent hours each day talking with analysts, describing everything they had learned about Taliban operations, terrain features, local dynamics, and tactical patterns. The information was incredibly valuable. Corwin had observed enemy activity patterns that coalition forces had never detected. They had identified weapons smuggling routes. They had mapped out the social networks that supported insurgent operations. 3 years of constant observation had made them an expert on that particular region. True to Calloway's word, the information about Operation Emberlight was made public in appropriate channels. The leak that had compromised the mission was officially acknowledged. The person responsible, a junior intelligence analyst who had been selling information, was named publicly. The families of Corwin's fallen teammates were given full briefings on what had happened. They learned that their loved ones had died, not because of any failure on their part, but because of betrayal from within. And they learned that one member of the team had survived and had continued the mission for 3 years in their honor. Calloway was present when Corwin met with the families. It was held in a private room at the base, away from media and official observers. 6 families, 6 sets of parents, siblings, spouses, and children. All of them had believed for 3 years that their loved one had died alone and forgotten in a nameless valley. Now they learned the truth. Corwin struggled through the meetings, describing the last hours of the team, the firefight, the courage each person had shown, the way they had fought to the end. And Corwin apologized for surviving when others did not, for not being able to save them, for leaving them behind. One of the mothers, a woman named Patricia Brennan, whose son had been Corwin's team leader, took Corwin's hands in hers. Her voice was firm and full of conviction. "You have nothing to apologize for. You survived. You carried on their mission. You became living proof that they mattered, that what they did mattered. My son would be so proud of you. Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for coming home." She pulled Corwin into a hug, and the dam finally broke. Corwin wept, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from the core of their being. 3 years of grief and guilt and isolation finally finding release. The other families embraced Corwin in turn. They thanked them. They told them they were not alone. They made it clear that Corwin was part of their extended family now, connected by bonds of shared loss and survival. It was the beginning of healing, not complete, not easy, but a beginning. Calloway visited Corwin in the hospital several times over those first weeks. They talked about the mission, about survival, about what came next. Corwin was adamant about one thing. "I want to go back. Not to that specific area, but back to work. I'm still a SEAL. I still have things to contribute." Calloway understood, but he was also realistic. That's a conversation for later. Right now, you focus on recovery, physical and mental. When you're ready, we'll talk about what role makes sense. The military bureaucracy moved slowly in updating Corwin's status. The paperwork to change them from killed in action to missing in action and then to active duty was complex and unprecedented. But it happened. 3 years after being declared dead, Nix Corwin was officially alive and returned to duty. The Navy struggled with how to acknowledge what had happened. They could not publicize the details because of classification. But they could not ignore it either. Eventually, they settled on a quiet ceremony at the Naval Special Warfare Base. No media, just the SEAL community. The ceremony was held on a clear morning in late spring. The entire community turned out. Hundreds of SEALs, past and present, gathered to honor one of their own who had endured the unendurable. Corwin stood at attention in a dress uniform that fit poorly because they were still regaining weight. Calloway and his entire team stood beside them. The commanding officer of Naval Special Warfare read a citation that carefully avoided classified details, but made clear the extraordinary nature of what Corwin had accomplished. 3 years of solo operations in denied territory, sustained combat effectiveness, protection of friendly forces, intelligence gathering of strategic value. Then he did something that had not been announced. He called forward the families of the fallen Emberlight team. Each family presented Corwin with a memorial bracelet bearing their loved one's name. Patricia Brennan spoke for all of them. You carried our sons and daughters with you every day in those mountains. You kept their memory alive. You completed their mission. Now, we ask you to carry these as a reminder, not of loss, but of brotherhood that transcends death. You are not alone. You have never been alone. Corwin accepted each bracelet with shaking hands, placing them carefully on their wrist until 6 silver bands encircled their arm. The commanding officer had one more element to the ceremony. He called Calloway and his team to attention. Then he did something remarkable. He saluted them, held the salute. The entire assembly joined in. Hundreds of SEALs saluting 8 men and 1 ghost, who had demonstrated the truest meaning of the SEAL ethos. Never leave a fallen comrade behind. The salute held for 30 seconds. Calloway felt tears on his face and did not care. Beside him, Moss was openly crying. They all were. When the salute finally dropped, the commanding officer spoke again. This community is built on trust. Trust that when you go into harm's way, your brothers will have your back. Trust that if you fall, you will not be forgotten. Trust that the mission and the team matter more than individual glory. Today we honor that trust. We honor Petty Officer Corwin, who kept faith with their fallen teammates. We honor Lieutenant Calloway and his team, who kept faith with Corwin, and we recommit ourselves to the principle that no one fights alone, not ever. The ceremony ended, and people began to disperse. But many stopped to speak with Corwin directly, offering respect, offering support, offering friendship. Corwin accepted it awkwardly at first, still not comfortable with attention or crowds, but gradually something shifted. The defensive walls that had kept them alive in the mountains began to lower. They began to smile, to laugh at jokes, to participate in conversations that had nothing to do with tactics or survival. The person who had existed before the trauma began to re-emerge, tentative and uncertain, but real. Calloway watched this transformation over the following months. Corwin began the long process of reintegration, therapy, physical training, medical treatment, social rehabilitation. It was not linear. There were setbacks and dark days, times when the weight of what they had endured felt too heavy, but the community surrounded them, made sure they were never alone, invited them to meals, included them in activities, gave them space when needed, but never let them isolate completely. 8 months after the extraction, Corwin was cleared for limited duty. They were assigned to the SEAL Training Command as an instructor. Specifically, they were tasked with teaching survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. Who better to teach those skills than someone who had lived them for 3 years? Corwin thrived in the role. They were demanding but fair. They pushed students hard but never beyond their limits. And they taught lessons that went beyond technical skills. Lessons about mental resilience, about adaptability, about finding purpose even in the darkest circumstances. Calloway heard from multiple sources that Corwin was exceptional as an instructor. Students respected them deeply, not just for their skills, but for their authenticity. Corwin did not pretend the work was easy or glamorous. They were honest about the costs, about the sacrifices, about the reality that sometimes you survive, but pieces of you don't. That honesty resonated with young SEALs who were being fed so much propaganda about invincibility and glory. Corwin offered truth instead, and truth, however difficult, was more valuable than comfortable lies. One afternoon, nearly a year after the extraction, Calloway received a call from Corwin. They asked if he wanted to take a drive. They picked him up in a beat-up truck and drove north along the coast. They did not talk much, just listened to music and watched the ocean. Eventually, Corwin pulled over at a beach overlook. They sat on the tailgate and stared at the water. After a long silence, Corwin spoke. "I've been thinking about the mountain. about what I lost there and what I found. I lost my team. I lost 3 years of my life. I lost parts of myself I'll never get back. But I also found something. I found out who I am when everything is stripped away. I found out I'm stronger than I thought. And I found out that even alone, I could still matter. I could still make a difference. That knowledge, it changes you. Calloway nodded, in a good way. Corwin thought about it. Both. It's power, but it's also burden. Because once you know you can survive anything, people expect you to survive everything. Once you prove you can operate alone, it's hard to convince others you need support. I'm still learning how to be a part of a team again, how to trust, how to ask for help. It's harder than surviving was. Calloway understood. That's because survival is simple, binary. You're alive or you're not. But living, really living, that's complicated. That's messy. That requires vulnerability. They sat in silence for a while longer. Then Corwin said something that stayed with Calloway forever. Thank you for not giving up on me, for coming back when you didn't have to, for seeing me as more than a ghost or a legend, for seeing me as a person who needed help even when I said I didn't. You saved my life, not just by extracting me from the mountain, but by giving me a reason to come down, by showing me there was still a place for me in the world. I'll never forget that. Calloway felt the weight of those words. You would have done the same for me. Corwin smiled slightly. Yeah, I would have. I guess that's what it means to be part of this community. We save each other, over and over, as many times as it takes. They sat there until the sun began to set, painting the ocean in shades of gold and red. Two warriors who had seen the worst humanity could offer, and had somehow found their way back to hope. Years later, Calloway would attend Corwin's promotion ceremony. They had continued to serve, continued to teach, continued to contribute. The ghosts that haunted them never fully left, but they learned to coexist with those ghosts, to honor the memory of the fallen while still living fully in the present. The ceremony was small and quiet, just as Corwin preferred, but the people who mattered were there. The families of the Emberlight team, Calloway and his entire team, the students whose lives Corwin had shaped through their teaching. In his remarks, the commanding officer noted that Corwin's story would never be fully public. Most of the world would never know what they had endured or accomplished. But that did not diminish its importance. Some of the most critical battles are fought in shadows by warriors whose names will never be known. Their victories are measured not in medals or recognition, but in lives saved and missions accomplished. Nyx Corwin embodied that truth. They had fought alone so others would not have to. They had endured so others could survive, and they had come home so they could help others learn to do the same. After the ceremony, Corwin found Calloway in the crowd. They clasped hands. Corwin spoke quietly. I'm thinking about writing something, not for publication, just for myself and maybe for future generations of SEALs who end up in impossible situations. A manual on surviving when survival seems impossible, on maintaining purpose when you're alone and forgotten, on finding your way home even when home seems like a dream. Calloway thought that was an excellent idea. The world needed that wisdom, needed to know that even in the darkest places, even when all seems lost, the human spirit could endure. The story of Nyx Corwin became part of SEAL lore, told quietly in team rooms and training facilities. Never officially documented, but never forgotten. New SEALs heard about the ghost in the mountains who fought alone for 3 years, about the team that went back for them, about the importance of never leaving anyone behind no matter how long it takes. The story became a reminder of what the community stood for, not individual heroics, but collective commitment. The understanding that you never fight alone, even when it feels like you do. Somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, on a ridge that few people will ever see, there are still signs of Nyx Corwin's presence, shell casings slowly being covered by dust, fighting positions gradually eroding, a cairn of stones that local shepherds leave undisturbed because they heard stories about the ghost who protected the innocent. Those physical traces will fade with time, but the impact of what happened there will not fade. 8 SEALs came home because one person refused to give up, and one ghost came home because 8 SEALs refused to leave them behind. That balance, that reciprocity, that absolute commitment to each other, that is what makes warriors into brothers and missions into legends. If someone in your life has ever fought battles that no one else could see, honor them by sharing their story. Recognition matters. Acknowledgement matters. The simple act of saying, "I see you, I know what you endured, you are not forgotten," that can mean everything to someone who fought alone in their own mountains. Subscribe to hear more stories of invisible warriors who changed the world from the shadows, because these stories deserve to be remembered, and the people who lived them deserve to be honored.